Welcome to the 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen, and today I'll be talking with Rabbi Angela Buchdahl about Heart of a Stranger, an unlikely rabbi's story of faith, identity, and belonging. Her moving memoir that weaves together her Korean and Jewish identities and invites us to see our own outsiderness as part of the story of Jewish belonging.
As a biracial Korean Jewish immigrant growing up in a very small Jewish community, I always felt like these are amazing stories, but I never saw myself represented in any book.
Angela Buchdahl was born in Seoul, the daughter of a Korean Buddhist mother and a Jewish American father. Profoundly spiritual from a young age, by 16 she felt the first stirrings to become a rabbi. Despite periods of self-doubt, would a mixed-race woman ever be seen as authentically Jewish or chosen to lead a congregation? She stayed the course, which took her first to Yale, then to rabbinical school, and to the pulpit of Central Synagogue, one of the largest, most influential congregations in the world, and even to the White House, where she led Hanukkah prayers under both the Obama and Biden administrations. In this episode, we'll talk about her love of Jewish fairy tales.
I love that these folktales came from across the Jewish diaspora. So you had folktales that came from Morocco or from Poland or from India, and it gave you a sense of the breadth of the Jewish lived experience over 2,000 years. It was tigers in Asia, and it would be bears in Poland. But I also love the magical nature of folktales and the way that they taught some deeper truth.
And we'll also hear about her congregation's response to her sermon in the wake of George Floyd's death about feeling like a stranger.
I had a shocking response, which was everybody felt like they had their story of why they felt like they were a stranger. And sometimes it had to do with like, oh, I grew up poor and my family couldn't afford high holiday tickets and I didn't feel like I belonged in the Jewish community. I'm gay and I didn't feel like the community accepted me. I'm disabled and the community doesn't let me. I don't have children and the Jewish community doesn't know what to do with people who don't have children. And what I realized is that like, if you just share the authentic experience of your lived life, I think that when we touch the deepest truths of our lives, it resonates for all.
All that and more coming up next. Angela, welcome to the 5 Books. Thank you so much for joining me today. I was so moved by Heart of a Stranger and the way your life narrative felt like a modern midrash almost on faith and belonging. And I'm excited to talk about it with you today.
Thank you so much.
I know you initially envisioned this book as a book of spiritual teachings in the spirit of Deepak Chopra before deciding on a memoir with you still have Jewish teachings connected to each chapter. I wanted to hear more about your initial goal for the book and how that goal sort of shaped how it evolved.
Well, I want to start by just saying that I grew up in a family that revered books. My Korean grandmother ran a bookstore in a small town in Korea, and my mother grew up just basically devouring books in the bookstore, which helped her open her worldview from this like little village that she was in and made her the first to go to college. And my father read to me every night all the way up until middle school. And essentially the public library, the children's room was like a secondary like daycare for me and my sister. My mom was like, I'm working late. Go to the library. I'll pick you up at 5. So books were just they were portals into another world. And I grew up loving books, and I'll talk about some of the ones that I loved with you today, but I never saw myself represented in any book. There was not a book about as a biracial Korean Jewish immigrant growing up in a very small Jewish community. I always felt like these are amazing stories. None of them look like me. And I think that there was a part of me that longed for feeling my story represented in some way. I think in an interesting way, the place that I found my story represented on a big scale was actually the book, the Torah. And it begins with this sort of seminal origin story of the Jewish people, which is the story of Abraham and Sarah being called to leave their birthplace and their homeland and to go to some place that was foreign to them, a place where they would become strangers in pursuit of some kind of elusive blessing. And, the story of boundary crossing is a story that is shared by both Korean side and my Jewish side of the families. And then it was also my personal story, both as an immigrant. And boundary crossings are not just about geographic boundaries, but sometimes familial expectations or gender expectations or our own mental roadblocks we put up for ourselves sometimes. So I think what I realized was the Jewish story is where I found myself represented in a way that made me feel understood, less lonely, somehow part of some bigger epic story that made me feel like I belonged to something when I felt like a stranger. So here I was, I really wanted to share my understanding of how the Jewish story helped me feel a sense of belonging and home and purpose with the wider world. And I think that that's not just for Jews. I think that it's the human experience to feel like you're the stranger and to want and long for belonging. So I think that I wanted to tell the Jewish story first because I felt like this is Jewish wisdom I want everyone to understand and told in an accessible way. But my teacher, Rabbi David Ellenson, said, all theology is autobiographical. So I realized in order to tell the Jewish story and the particular way that I was understanding it, I needed to tell some of my own story. So I hope that people will find something of themselves in this book in one way or another.
What are we supposed to do and say and be during this time?
Judaism has so much complexity to it and so many layers to it that no one layer stands by itself.
What you have is Jews who for the very first time feel like their value system is out of sync with the broader sector.
I'm your host, Alana Steinhain. Welcome to Texting IRL, where we wrestle with the dilemmas of Jewish life through the lens of classical and modern Torah texts. I am so fortunate that I have a friend and a colleague who I can talk to, Jacob Feinspan, Diana Ginsburg, Dahlia Lithwick, helping us think through these big questions.
Why are you guys part of this? What calls you personally to it? What are some of the other things that you work on? What's at stake for you?
I think one of the challenges is to figure out how much failed democracy we as Jews can tolerate.
We have to find opportunities to make enemies into friends.
The model is so majestic in this text.
Listen now to Texting IRL, a podcast from the Shalom Hartman Institute, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to the beauty of Jewish interpretation.
Exactly.
Book 1, A Jewish Book from Childhood, All of a Kind Family by Sydney Taylor. You spent your first 5 years in Korea. I'm curious what you remember about that transition to life in Tacoma.
I think the big difference is that when I was growing up in Korea, we were living in multi-generational sort of family community. So my grandmother lived with me, my Korean aunties lived nearby, and there was kind of constantly this hubbub of family and cousins and meals and just surrounded by this sense of like embeddedness in a community. And when I moved to America, we did move to Tacoma, which is where my father's family lived, but it felt much more separated. And we, obviously we didn't live with other family members. And I spent a good amount of time with my Jewish family and spent Jewish holidays together and everything else. But I think that my mother felt particularly isolated, especially coming from her experience in Korea. And I think that she went through a very difficult chapter herself. And we were all trying to find our way. I remember feeling like I didn't feel like I was fully at home as an American or as a Jew, but I also recognized after my first trip to Korea that I wasn't really Korean anymore either. So that sense of homelessness actually was deeply painful, and I was grateful that my mother helped frame it as an opportunity to create home wherever I was. I'm not sure I always felt that.
Your mom's story was fascinating. I'm hoping you can tell us a bit about her family. And just, you described sitting at the intersection of these two worlds, your mother's Korean family, who had a very painful history of displacement. And what I found so fascinating was that your Jewish family, you grew up in the same synagogue in the same town as your great-grandparents. I don't think I've ever met another Jew whose fourth generation in the same synagogue. It's such an unusual Jewish story. So I wonder if you could talk about that.
So my mom lived the story that many Americans don't know of the Japanese occupation of Korea, which, began in the 1920s and included a kind of a wholesale kidnapping, for lack of a better word, of a lot of Koreans to Japan, in particular Korean intellectuals, artists, and potters. And basically they took the sort of cultural capital of Korea and imported it to Japan. My great-grandfather was a Confucian scholar. So my grandmother ended up in Japan in the 1920s as a 5-year-old girl, lived in Japan for all her childhood into her young adulthood, and ran a boarding house, which is one of the few things that a Korean woman in Japan could do. My grandfather was sort of this renegade, nationalistic Korean fighter for Korea's freedom from Japanese occupation. And he essentially ran messages between Korea and Korean nationals living in Japan. Ended up staying at my grandmother's boarding house. They fell in love, got married, and my mother was born in Japan under the occupation, forced to take a Japanese name, to only speak Japanese when she was young. And then when the World War II was over and the occupation ended, my family moved back to Korea. So my mother already had this sense of 2 generations of displacement, her mother being displaced first and then her being displaced by coming back to her homeland. Interestingly, her family wasn't fully accepted because my grandmother spoke Korean with a Japanese accent. So even though she was 100% native Korean blood, she was a foreigner. So I think that this all gave a different sensitivity to my mother. It's probably why she was able to marry my American Jewish father and feel like somehow that made sense to her. And I was born in Korea, and for the 3rd generation on my Korean side, I again also moved at age 5 to a different country, this time to America. And so there was this long history on my Korean side of sort of displacement and movement. Ironically, as you pointed out, it's my Jewish side that felt deeply rooted in Tacoma, of all places. My great-great-grandparents were woodworkers in Romania. They ended up in the Pacific Northwest, I think because, I don't know, lots of trees there, and started a millwork business of like fireplaces, moldings, doors, and cabinets. And it was a 100-year business, basically, that 3 generations worked in. Tacoma had a small community, but it was tight-knit. Everybody knew each other. They cared for each other. They socialized almost exclusively with each other up until my grandmother's generation. My father also mostly had Jewish friends as well. And I was the 4th generation to become bat mitzvah in that synagogue. So I do think it's very special that here I am coming to Tacoma as a Korean immigrant, but I was also entering into a place where I had yichus, for lack of a better word, and felt deeply rooted. And my rabbi was so welcoming of my Korean mother, which is a gift and not something I take for granted, because there was only one synagogue in Tacoma. If he had not been welcoming, we would have not been a part of the Jewish community, but instead we were embraced. And I think it's interesting that there were, in the end of the day, about 300 families that are Jewish in Tacoma, but about 30,000 Koreans in Tacoma. So ironically, I had a very large Korean community to be a part of, and so did my mother, whereas the Jewish side was actually quite small.
And you were so much a part of the fabric of your synagogue. You talk about yourself being like a Jewish spokesperson.
I loved my synagogue. I was that nerdy kid who liked Hebrew school. I had a lot of God questions I was always asking my rabbi. And I just was preoccupied with religious questions. Like that was sort of my yearning. So maybe that was the early sign that I was going to be interested in this. I started song leading when I was only 14, in part because I had a transformative experience with a Jewish song leader that came through Tacoma for a few years, started a kids choir, and that was like, it made me feel spiritually alive for the first time. And when she left, I was so bereft, and I kept complaining that we needed a new music teacher. And finally, my religious school educator was like, Angela, we don't have another music school teacher, but you sing and play guitar, so go to Jewish camp, learn as much music as you can, and come back and teach. So I became sort of the de facto music teacher. And then in my high school, my sister and I were 2 of the 3 Jews in my 1,300 person high school, I became also the de facto Jewish representative. And I was also student body president. And so I was already kind of had a leadership role in the school. They would frequently make me the school Jew to light the menorah at the Christmas assembly, among other things.
Yeah, so you've really just continued in that role, doing the same at the White House.
Just in a much bigger Jewish community, but yes.
Yeah, exactly. So tell me when you read All of a Kind Family.
So growing up, I did not feel like I grew up with that sort of romanticized, thick Jewish extended community like the way I thought New York was. And in my public library, which I mentioned, I grew up like living in that children's room. There weren't a lot of Jewish books that were there. But thankfully, my Sunday school had a bookmobile, which is essentially a cart that had a bunch of Jewish books on it. And every Sunday at Sunday school, we were allowed to borrow one book. And I always borrowed a book, and I loved opening a world of what I thought was like this Jewish life that I did not see in Tacoma, Washington. Books like Carp in the Bathtub, certainly. And I don't even remember all the names of these books, but it was in some way the way that I was like formulating what I thought Jewish life should look like, because I had this Korean mother who didn't really know how to create a Jewish home. And I had a Jewish Reform cultural Jewish father who was deeply identified as a Jew, but in many ways would claim that he was pretty illiterate as a Jew. So I remember feeling like I was reading these books to understand this is what Jews do. The All of a Kind Family series, I just was so taken with it. My sister and I read them together. I loved that there were sisters. I loved that it was opening up a world of kind of gritty immigrant New York, that even though it was so far from where I was, the immigrant experience felt very familiar to me. And so I particularly gravitated toward that series and read, I think, all of them multiple times.
Book 2, A Jewish Book from Adulthood, Elijah's Violin and Other Jewish Fairy Tales, selected and retold by Howard Schwartz.
So I'll start by just saying that I really, really loved fairy tales, folk tales, and I kind of ingested folk tales of all kinds. So I'll begin by saying that my mother was a big storyteller. And I think in many ways, the primary way she shared sort of Korean values was through folk tales. And so she would frequently tell them. But that was sort of the oral tradition. She didn't read them necessarily out of books. I also had big collections of illustrated Grimm's fairy tales, and I loved those. And then I discovered the world of Jewish folktales, which I particularly loved because, first of all, many of them had biblical characters that time traveled into different places, of course, like Elijah, but also other figures as well. I love that these folktales came from across the Jewish diaspora. So you had folktales that came from Morocco or from Poland or from India, and it gave you a sense of the breadth of the Jewish lived experience over 2,000 years, and ways that each Jewish community that lived in different places took on some of the cultural symbols and language of the place in which they lived. There's no question that they were influenced by, it was tigers in Asia and it would be bears in Poland. You just would take on different characters that would play in these fairy tales. But I also love the magical nature of folktales and the way that they taught some deeper truth. They weren't true. I knew that they didn't actually happen. They were folktales. But there was always something about folktales that taught some deeper truth that I resonated with. And so I actually think that it's a lost art to telling folktales and fairy tales to our children. I also think that fairy tales and folktales of old were not afraid to have scary characters or death in them. I think that a lot of our children's literature of today are sanitized of real life issues. And I think that fairy tales gave us a chance to grapple with some of the difficult things that happen in the world in a way that we could manage. And they generally always had a happy ending, which I know life doesn't always. But I think that that's what I found so appealing about Jewish folktales. And that particular collection is a beautiful one that I read many, many times. And as I became a young rabbi, I used to lead a family service, and every week I told a Jewish folktale, and that was part of my practice. So I also developed the art of telling a Jewish story, which I think in some ways was a foundation of this book as well.
Was there one particular story that stands out for you?
So I'm not sure that this one was in Elijah's fairy tales book or in a different collection of folktales, because now they are meshed together. There is this amazing story that like haunts me about this man who is always seeking the meaning of life, and he searches everywhere around the world. Ultimately, he ends up in this deep forest, and he finds this cottage with lights, and each one is a little vessel that has a wick and a certain amount of oil in it. And he learns from a man who mysteriously appears in the little cottage that every one of these candles represents a life. Some of them are in fancy golden tins, and some of them are in simple little containers. And some of them he could see they have a lot of oil left, meaning there's a lot of life left in them. And some of them he could see are almost down to the end and their life is almost over. As he walks through this cottage, the cottage just kind of mysteriously keeps going and going and going. The old man says, "Do you want to see your candle?" And the man says, I do. So he goes and he shows him his candle, and he's terrified to see that his candle is almost out of oil. And he looks and sees that the old man has disappeared, and he decides that he sees a candle next to it, which has a lot of oil in it. And when no one's looking, he goes to pour oil from someone else's candle into his. And then the old man grabs his hand and says, "Is this the meaning of life you were seeking?" And then the candles and the cottage disappears, and the man is left to kind of contemplate. I find that story compelling on lots of levels, but it's not a story that has like just a perfect ending. You know, you're always wondering, who's the old man? What is the meaning of these stories? I think tales like this give us so much spiritual meat and opportunities for sort of moral questions that I think regular life doesn't always let us.
Storytelling is such a big part of what you do. You know, I don't know how you think about sermons in the context, or and you use songs. I'm wondering how you see storytelling as fitting into those other mediums.
I think storytelling is the quickest way to building empathy and understanding of another person's experience. And I really do think that my greatest sermonic oration will not change someone's mind the way a very compelling story will. I think that's really the only thing that ever does change people's hearts and minds is storytelling. So I lean heavily into it, and I not in a manipulative way, but in just sort of once you can hear someone's story and get inside their experience and think about what it feels like to inhabit that experience, I think there's almost no way as human beings you can't be affected by that. So yeah, I try to use storytelling as a way of building connection and understanding. And so very much this story itself, my memoir, is an attempt to kind of tell my story in a way that helps people understand an experience that might feel very different. And yet I've learned that the more specific and particular the storytelling is, the more universally the messages seem to resonate with others. I have a chapter in there about race and a sermon I gave 5 years ago after George Floyd was murdered, and I wanted to give a high holiday sermon about race. And I was going to talk about sort of the national reckoning with race, but I realized that there was a story that was much smaller about my own relationship with facing some racism within the Jewish community that I had never told. And I remember talking to another rabbi about the fact that I was going to give this sermon, and he said, "Well, that's really nice, but do you think that people are really going to relate to that? I mean, your experience is so unique, Angela," which is true. There aren't a lot of, Jews of color who grew up in Tacoma and know what it feels like to be the stranger. I took the risk because I wanted to share this story, and I really felt like there was something about hearing what the experience is, and it wasn't just me. There are Jews of color in my congregation, and I thought, okay, if for no other reason, I'm going to tell our story a little bit. I had a shocking response, which was everybody felt like they had their story of why they felt like they were a stranger. And sometimes it had to do with like, oh, I'm from Birmingham, and with my accent, when I'm up here, I feel like I don't belong. Oh, I grew up poor and my family couldn't afford high holiday tickets, and I didn't feel like I belonged in the Jewish community. I'm gay and I didn't feel like the community accepted me. You can fill in the blank. I'm disabled and the community doesn't let me. I don't have children and the Jewish community doesn't know what to do with people who don't have children. I could go on. And there are so many ways that people feel this experience. And what I realize is that, like, if you just share the authentic experience of your lived life, I think that when we touch the deepest truths of our lives, it resonates for all. And that's my attempt of what this storytelling was about.
You did it to such beautiful effect also with your Ishmael and Hagar story that you told in your, so for anyone who hasn't, they should watch your Rosh Hashanah sermon, right?
Yeah.
That was beautiful. Book 3, a book that changed your worldview. Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent by Isabel Wilkerson.
I mentioned that summer that George Floyd was murdered and there was really this larger national reckoning about race. That was also when Isabel Wilkerson that summer put out her book, Caste, which I immediately read and thought to myself, this is one of the most paradigm shifting books that I've ever read. Part of it is that she really dispelled the category of race and explained that actually what we're dealing with is a caste system that has principles that are applicable across caste systems, across geography and across time. So she created these parallels where she studied both the caste system in India, which is the one that most of us think of. When we think of a caste system, we say, oh, well, yeah, India, they have a caste system. But she also showed that it wasn't just a race issue in America with African Americans starting with enslavement, but it was actually a caste issue. And then she showed how those exact principles of how we created these hierarchies of human value with a caste system in America around race, which included things like laws that didn't allow people to intermarry, laws that kept people separated, using language that made it almost feel like it's divinely ordained that these people are of a different kind. She showed very clearly and with a lot of academic scholarly background that those exact principles were copied by Nazis to create the caste system, which enabled the Holocaust and the genocide of 6 million Jews. It is brilliant what she does, and it helped me understand that these tools, these strategies of people who want to create hierarchies of human value, they use the language of race because that makes it feel like it's immutable and genetic and that you can't change it. But actually all race is really just a fiction. It's a creation of people who want to actually create supremacy of some people over others. And when she used that language of caste and then showed how it worked across Nazi Germany, American race relations, and the Indian caste system, it really turned my head about what we're dealing with and why, once and for all, I wanted the Jewish community to not think of Jews as a race. We are obviously a peoplehood, and that is deeply important. And I would even say we're a culture, or we're multiple cultures and multiple ethnicities. But calling us a race is what our enemies have called us. And we need to stop clinging to this idea that we have some sort of racial DNA that makes us who we are. And I'm surprised at how durable this idea is and how much people, Jews, still cling to this idea of Jews as a race, because it makes them feel somehow that this is like who they are at the core and that there's in some sort of bloodline that goes all the way back to Abraham and Sarah. I can't tell you how many people came up to me after I gave this sermon and said, but I took my 23andMe test and I'm 99.9% Ashkenazi DNA. Like, that proves that it's race. And I said, even that is a fiction. I've talked to Anne Majewski, who runs 23andMe, and they try to create groupings that make sense around racial categories, but she admits that this is not scientific, even though it uses scientific language. Yes, you might be 100% Ashkenazi DNA. That is not just Jewish DNA. There's a lot of other kinds of DNA that's Jewish. And does that somehow make you more Jewish than someone who might have Sephardi DNA or Iraqi Mizrahi DNA or even someone who converted? Like, are you saying that that's more Jewish? So I think that these questions about race for us as a Jewish community in particular was dispelled for me, and I had different language when I read that book, Caste. I highly recommend it to everyone.
I know it's really important to you to build an inclusive Jewish community. Has that book changed how you've gone about doing that in your own work?
I think that just naming my experience, because I was naive to think that once I became the senior rabbi of Central, that my synagogue would not treat Jews of color the way I'd been treated. And I no longer am treated that way because everybody knows who I am in my synagogue, obviously. But what I didn't appreciate until 5 years ago when people started talking about some of the issues is Jews of color in my congregation came forward and told me of their experiences of racism within my synagogue. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, we have not fixed this yet. And that's when I think just naming the problem and talking about it more has changed it. I also realized holes. We did not have a single Jew of color on our board, for example. Now we have several, but it took us some time to even change some of the ways that our community operates without even thinking about it. And I'm embarrassed to say I'm obviously a Jew of color, but some of these things were just still not fully on my radar. So I think it has been about visibility. It's been about transparency and conversations. It's been about representation. All of that has made a difference.
Book 4, the book you're reading now, As a Jew, by Sarah Hurwitz.
I really admire Sarah Hurwitz, and her book, As a Jew, is the next book on my bedside table to read. I'm bringing it on my book tour, and I think that she is putting forth a really important challenge for all of us to think about both the nature of our own Jewish identities and the depth of it and whether or not we are doing enough, and the ways that we have inherited, imbibed, and taken on some of the language of those who have hated us over the centuries and allowed some of that to shift the definition of who we are as Jews and what matters to us. And I think that just, again, sometimes knowing what the issue is raises our awareness and helps us change it.
Book 5, the author's latest book, Heart of a Stranger, An Unlikely Rabbi's Story of Faith, Identity, and Belonging, by Angela Buchdahl. Heart of a Stranger feels like a culmination of so many of the themes that we're talking about, belonging and identity and faith and the courage to claim your own story. You write that a rabbi's job is to immerse herself in this perennial conversation. What does that conversation mean to you, and what compelled you to step into it, not just as a rabbi, but as a writer?
I really got to do the first serious Jewish learning of my life when I went on the Bronfman Fellowship when I was 16. I mean, I went to Hebrew school. It was great. We were doing a lot of decoding of Hebrew, singing Israeli folk songs. These were all great things. I felt very joyful. We were not doing serious Jewish learning. And I also went to a decent public school, but not one that I found to be super intellectually challenging or stimulating. So I arrive in Israel on this study program with a group of 25 other Jews, and I get exposed to Jewish learning, like deep Jewish learning, by the best teachers for the first time in my life. And I literally felt like my head was exploding with the questions that these texts were inviting me to contemplate. And the feeling that I was not only in conversation with some incredible peers and incredible teachers, but I was in conversation with Jews of generations past and the greatest rabbinic thinkers over the centuries across lands all around the world. I couldn't believe that this is what learning could feel like or look like. And I wanted to be a part of that conversation, both with the present moment and my own life, but also with the wisdom of the past. Like, I found that when I was looking at a text around identity or family relations or one of the many things that are addressed through Torah, Talmud, Midrash, through all of our rich textual tradition, I would find answers to questions that I was asking of myself. I found that it was asking questions of me that I might not have ever contemplated about what is my purpose? Why am I here? How are we supposed to behave? How are we supposed to react? It wasn't the simple questions, and it wasn't always giving me answers, but it was pushing the questions. And I found that to be the most incredible, exciting, thrilling experience of my life to date. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, there is a job. It's called a rabbi, where you get to do this all the time. Now, I say this in the book also. That is not what I get to do all the time as a rabbi, to just sit there and contemplate big questions and look at texts. It is definitely a part of what I get to do. But when I get to touch that, be in conversation, and then translate it for this moment for a group of people today that are struggling with these questions, to me, there's something so thrilling, and it feels like we are putting ourselves into that story. And if that's not a part of like what it means to have a purpose and meaning, like to feel like you get to put a piece of your voice into this perennial, eternal, epic story of the Jewish people, that's why I'm a rabbi. And I feel the privilege of that every day.
It really sounded like that summer was pivotal for you. And
yeah, I would say it was the most transformative summer of my life. And I've lived 53 summers, and I still look back at that summer as the most important summer of my life. Yeah.
Important, and also not necessarily all easy and wonderful. You know, it sounds like you really were confronted with people who had very different ideas about what it meant to be a Jew, who made you feel excluded. You talk about your sister having that same experience on the Bronfman program and reacting to it pretty differently than you. And then you write about your mother a few years later when you're back in Israel, and you have this similar experience of feeling like you're fighting your way in. I wonder if you could tell us that story and your mom.
The Bronfman summer was really the first time that I understood that there were a good number of Jews out there, maybe the majority, who didn't see me as Jewish legally, halachically, because I didn't have a Jewish mother. And the traditional law for many centuries has been traced through the matrilineal line, even though, of course, in the Bible, it was patrilineal. But let's just say that that's not where Jewish law sits today. And so it was the first time I was exposed to the idea that people didn't see me as actually legally a Jew. That was very challenging. It set off a kind of an existential Jewish identity crisis that lasted all through college, like for the next 5-6 years. And one of the summers before my senior year in college, I went back to Israel. This was now my third trip to Israel, and on a Dorot fellowship doing research for my senior thesis. And I was living with someone who had become a Baalat Tshuva at that moment. And so she was really digging into her kind of traditional Jewish law. And she was a friend, but she was really seeing me as not authentically Jewish in the way that I was practicing. And then I had a couple of encounters with people who really rejected me because I didn't have a Jewish mother. I was just hitting lots of walls of identity. At this point, I also wanted to be a rabbi. So here I was, I wanted to devote my life to the Jewish people and be a Jewish leader. And I kept getting told, wait a minute, you're not even a Jew, let alone a Jewish leader. And it was so existentially painful for me. And I particularly had one moment where it wasn't external. It was that I called myself up for an aliyah. I volunteered myself, and I was seeing this as my test. I was with a group of women at the wall. And when I went to say the words of the blessing, which I had said 1,000 times before, I just screwed up the words in the moment. And all the women corrected me. And I know that doesn't sound like that's that big of a deal, but because in my mind I had set this up as like my moment, my test to show everyone that I belonged, that I was a Jew, I felt like that was a massive failure. And it was like a breaking point for me after a series of many, many hurts and rejections along the way. I remember I called my mother from Israel, and that was back when you had to pay long distance for every minute. I couldn't even speak for 5 minutes. I was like heaving, crying, and I was like done with Judaism. I was done being Jewish. And my mother listened very patiently on the other line to my tears. And I said, Mom, I could just stop being a Jew. I don't have a Jewish face. I don't have a Jewish name. Nobody would even know. People wouldn't even care if I stopped being a Jew. And my mother, she said, is that really possible? It's so good that she asked a question instead of just saying, yes, you are. Of course, you're a Jew. That I would have rejected. But when she said, is that really possible? It actually forced me to imagine that I could shed my Judaism the way you'd shed a coat. And I realized I can't stop being a Jew any more than I could stop being Korean, or any more than I could stop being a woman or being who I am. And suddenly I recognized and identified this deep in my bones Jewish soul that I had kind of not fully accepted as real up until that moment. I was 20 years old, 21 years old. That moment of kind of what I call rock bottom. The good thing about hitting rock bottom is it is a form of landing. Like I finally stopped falling. I just sort of felt like, okay, I've hit the bottom. I dusted myself off. I'm still a Jew. That's it. So that sort of paved the way for me to feel comfortable and not defensive about having a giur, which I termed a reaffirmation ceremony, because I wanted to actually mark some form of landing that I'd come to that felt like, okay, I actually feel secure in this identity. I might not have the status for every Jew in the world, and this giur is not going to change that for everybody either. But I know that I'm a Jew in my heart, not just in my heart, but in my Jewish memory and in my learning and in my leadership. But it was important to me to have a halachic conversion, and I had a beit din of 3 rabbis. I dipped in a mikveh. I had a halachic giur. It was a transformative ritual moment for me. And then I felt ready to move forward. And I really haven't looked back since then. I mean, it's not that there haven't been moments that I've had my insecurities in certain situations, but it no longer felt like I ever questioned that I was a Jew.
You write about it so movingly. It also feels like, it's the beginning of that process of a conversion, not a conversion, a giur, affirmation, reaffirmation. And also for you, it seems like you were able to bring in your Korean heritage to your Jewish teaching in a different way, which I found so beautiful in how you described your mother and that experience. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about speaking and singing at the Seoul National University in South Korea.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to start by saying it wasn't an accident that I began the book with the story of going to the mountain, which in Tacoma is the mountain, is Mount Rainier, and taking a trip there, the first kind of pilgrimage for my mother to the mountain. And I began there because my whole story is the story of being a rabbi. But in order to understand the rabbi I became, I needed to explain a little piece of my mother's spirituality and the way that her spirituality infused the way that I understood my Judaism. So that's why I began with that explanation of my mother's influence on the spiritual language that I spoke of the world and the way I saw the world. And yet it was translated into Jewish vocabulary because like she talks about oneness, and then I related it to the way the Shema is about God being one. So it is all interwoven in a way that is, I can't really separate it all out, but I think that every one of us brings the multiplicity of our identities into the way we see God and the world and our theology and the way we'll read Jewish texts, which is why, thank God, the Jewish community is so diverse. It's why we get such richness when we look at our Jewish texts together. So I think that's part of what I wanted to say. I generally speaking, growing up, felt like I was compartmentalizing my Korean and Jewish sides. I mean, quite literally, we would have family gatherings that would be the Korean family gatherings, which we served Korean food, or the Jewish family gatherings, which would be around holidays. And we did not mix them. And I would spend a lot of time with Korean family, which were almost all church going. My Korean aunt became a minister. And so it was very connected to that part of my life. And then my Jewish side was so separate. And so I often felt like if one identity was up, the other one necessarily had to get pushed down. Near the end of the book, I talk about the first experience of going back to Korea, not just as a Korean, but actually as a rabbi, which is the first time that I didn't feel like I was separating out being Korean and being Jewish. But I got to go to Korea because I was a rabbi. It was the opening of the first Israel Research Center at Seoul National University, which is the largest flagship public university of Korea. They were opening the first center for the study of Israel, Hebrew, and Jewish studies. It's kind of shocking that until a year ago, there was no place on a university level in Korea where you could study Judaism, Hebrew, and Israeli history. So I was given the privilege of giving the keynote address at the opening of this new Seoul National Israel Center. And my parents came. It was my Korean relatives came, and there was something so powerful about feeling that, like, maybe just for this moment, especially when the entire world seemed to be closing its academic doors on Israel. There was only one country, I believe, in the entire world that opened a new Israel Center post-2023, and that was my homeland. And so I felt like I was able to play this role as a Korean Jew and rabbi for the first time in my life that maybe could not have been possible otherwise. And it brought these two worlds together in a way that almost felt like maybe this is the purpose of why I became a Korean rabbi in the first place. So it was really a profound experience for me. And I was so grateful that my parents lived to see it, because for them, in many ways, all of the challenges of bringing these two worlds together, the hardships that it sometimes meant for both of them, in some ways they felt like this is why we have the family that we have.
You describe it beautifully in the book, and you talk about singing two songs that you melded together, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, Jerusalem of Gold, and a Korean folk song that I won't be able to tell you the name of.
Arirang, which is the most famous Korean folk song, yeah.
It brought everything together for you, right? You're a trained cantor. You're such a powerful leader, both in the pastoral care in your sermons, but also so much through song and through your song leading, which, as you talked about, was at the very root of your Jewish identity. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about music and the role that singing has had in your spiritual life.
I would call music my native spiritual language. Like, before I felt fully at home in Judaism, I was singing to God, and that was like just a natural thing. And by the way, as weird as that sounds, because I recognize that that's sort of a weird thing, I also will argue that I think if you watch kids are all singing their way through their early years of life. They're, narrating their experience by singing. I mean, I have great videos of my children, and my daughter is like, and then I became a beautiful butterfly, and so, most kids get embarrassed out of singing their way through life, as if they're living in their own musical. I was lucky that my parents never did. And so it was the way that I connected. And when this first music teacher in my synagogue brought this kids choir together and gave me language, some of it in Hebrew, some of it literally the song Sing Unto God, that was a new Debbie Friedman song at the time, I was like, this is what I've been waiting for my whole life. I'm singing to God. And I found it not just a way that I was connecting to something much bigger than myself, like some force of the universe, but also to other people around me, that singing together was an immediate and maybe the quickest way of connecting with others. And so when I found that experience, to me, I would still say that that's probably the time that I most clearly understand that God is present. So yes, I became a cantor. I was very fortunate to be able to lead music and create a worship experience at Central that is primarily about the music and has brought many people together. I would argue that today, part of the reason I'm able to hold a diverse community together through the kind of polarization of our many strong ideologies and politics and different views on Israel, because my community is really carrying that diversity within it. One of the reasons I'm able to hold this community together is because when we sing together, we transcend those differences. There is something deep that is happening when we pray together, sing together, serve something bigger than ourselves together. That's what we have to get back to, because yes, we can think differently about a lot of things, but we are connecting to something unifying, something bigger than all those differences. And singing is maybe my surest way to get us there.
I guess I just want to close with asking you, what part of your rabbinic role feels most challenging right now, and what gives you the most hope?
I think what feels particularly challenging right now is, in my lifetime, I have never seen the Jewish community feel this anxious, afraid, worried. And when we come from a place of fear or threat, then the person who disagrees with us is not just disagreeing, they become dangerous. They become the threat. And that language, we've been seeing that in the Jewish community, and it's part of what has really torn the Jewish community apart, and in some cases even torn families apart, which has been so painful to watch families that are feeling threatened by the ideas of someone in their family enough that they are just estranged from each other over Israel, for example. And that is the most challenging experience I've had as a rabbi, and we're still in it. I think what makes me feel hopeful is that people continue, when they hear stories of others, their hearts are opened and their minds are changed. And people change. People can change. Our tradition deeply believes that people can change. And I don't mean that just on the level of like a micro, like you can be forgiven, you can stop doing something that hurts someone. I mean that even on a collective level, we can see that whole peoples who have been at war with each other for generations can actually make peace and change and move forward in a different way. We have seen that story before. We tell that story. So if we believe the stories that we know, if we believe the Jewish memory we've actually experienced, then of course change is possible and hope is eternal. So that is what keeps me getting up every day and grateful to be able to do this work.
It's such an inspiring message to end with. And I think your whole book is so inspiring in the way that you weave your personal story as you talk about once you speak for your particular experience. It does feel so universal. It gave me a whole new language for thinking about belonging, and I think it will help people understand what I think our tradition really speaks for. So thank you so much for sharing it with us and for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the 5 Books. Our guest today was Rabbi Angela Buchdahl, talking about her memoir, Heart of a Stranger. You can find a link to the book, her sermon, and all the other books we discussed in our show notes. If you've read one of the fantastic books recommended on our show, we'd love to hear about it. Drop us a comment on our Instagram @5bookspod or in our email, team@5bookspod.org. If you'd like an email reminder to keep you up to date with new episodes, plus links to all the books we discussed and some other goodies directly in your inbox, you can sign up for our newsletter in the show notes or on our website, 5bookspod.org. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin. Editorial and website support from Amelia Merrill. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Elad Lifshitz of Dove Abramson Studio. Thanks especially to the Jewish Book Council.